One of the most famous true horror stories involving a fake police officer is the Zodiac Killer's fake cop routine, which took place in California during the late 1960s. The Zodiac Killer remains one of the most notorious, unsolved serial killer cases in American history, and one of the Zodiac's tactics involved posing as a law enforcement officer to gain the trust of his victims. The Zodiac Killer's fake cop incident, 1969. On the night of September 27, 1969, Bryan Hartnell and Cecelia Shepard were enjoying a peaceful picnic at Lake Berryessa, California. The setting was picturesque and serene, perfect for a quiet afternoon. However, their idyllic evening turned into a real-life horror story that would haunt the public for decades. As they lay by the lake, they noticed a strange man approaching. He was tall and wore an unusual outfit, a black hood covering his head with a white, crossed circle symbol stitched on his chest. But what was even more unsettling was the man's behavior. As he got closer, he claimed to be an escaped convict who had killed a guard and stolen a car. Then, in an eerie and calculated move, he produced a gun and said he needed to tie them up because he was planning to steal their car to get away. At first, Bryan and Cecelia believed they were merely being robbed. The man was calm and methodical. He told them that he needed their car to flee to Mexico, and they cooperated, trying to de-escalate the situation. But soon it became clear that robbery wasn't his true motive. The man produced pre-cut lengths of clothesline and ordered Bryan to tie up Cecelia first, before binding Bryan's hands and feet. Once they were bound and helpless, the assailant revealed his true intentions. Without warning, he drew a large knife and began stabbing both Bryan and Cecelia repeatedly. Bryan was stabbed 6 times, and Cecelia was stabbed 10 times. After the brutal assault, the attacker calmly walked away, leaving the couple bleeding on the ground, thinking they were going to die. But the terror didn't end there. The man walked back to their car and used a black marker to scrawl a message on the vehicle's door. He wrote the dates of previous attacks, the location of this attack, and a signature, the crossed circle symbol that would come to be known as the Zodiac Killer's signature. Before he left, the man phoned the Napa County Police Department from a payphone and calmly reported the crime himself, giving them the details and location of the attack, all while speaking in a monotonous and emotionless voice. Police raced to the scene, but by the time they arrived, the killer was long gone. Cecelia and Bryan were found alive but critically wounded. Tragically, Cecelia would later die from her injuries, but Bryan survived and was able to provide some details to the police about the attack. This incident became part of a string of killings that the Zodiac Killer would go on to claim responsibility for, each murder more terrifying than the last. The killer's tactic of using a fake identity, sometimes a police officer, sometimes a threatening fugitive, was part of his horrific pattern of manipulation and sadism. Although the Zodiac Killer's identity has never been definitively proven, his legacy as one of the most elusive and terrifying criminals in history remains. The fact that he posed as different figures, including a police officer at times, to gain control over his victims is a chilling reminder that trust can be weaponized by those with evil intentions. To this day, the Zodiac case remains open, with amateur sleuths and investigators still trying to crack the code of his cryptic messages and understand the full scope of his crimes. What makes this story even more horrifying is that the killer may have never been caught and could have lived out the rest of his life in anonymity. Another chilling and famous story involving a fake police officer is the case of David Parker Ray, the Toy Box Killer, which occurred in New Mexico during the 1990s. This disturbing case highlights how Ray posed as a police officer to lure and abduct his victims, leading them into unimaginable horror. The Toy Box Killer, 1999. David Parker Ray was a sadistic serial offender who is believed to have kidnapped, tortured, and killed multiple women over the course of several decades. His crimes were so shocking that law enforcement has struggled to comprehend their full scale. Ray is believed to have operated out of a soundproof trailer, which he referred to as his toy box, where he subjected his victims to unimaginable torment. But what made Ray particularly dangerous was his use of deception, often pretending to be a police officer to gain the trust of his victims. The case that brought Ray to light involved the courageous escape of one of his victims, Cynthia Vigil. The abduction of Cynthia Vigil. On March 22, 1999, 22-year-old Cynthia Vigil was walking down a street in Albuquerque, New Mexico, when a man claiming to be an undercover police officer approached her. Ray flashed what looked like a legitimate badge and told Vigil she was under arrest for solicitation. She had no reason to question the authenticity of the man standing in front of her. After all, he had the badge, the demeanor, and the authority of an officer. However, this was no real arrest. Ray handcuffed Vigil and forced her into his vehicle. Instead of taking her to a police station, he drove her to a remote location, a trailer in the desert that would later be known as Ray's toy box. It was here that Vigil realized she had fallen into the clutches of a monster. Ray's trailer was a nightmare. The inside was like something out of a horror movie, filled with devices of torture, chains, whips, and other horrifying instruments. He had meticulously soundproofed the trailer and outfitted it with gynecological tables, surgical tools, and recordings of his voice, which played instructions on how to break the will of his victims. Ray, along with his girlfriend and accomplice, Cindy Hendy, held Vigil captive for 3 days. She was tortured in unspeakable ways. They used drugs to disorient her, intending to eventually kill or discard her like many others before her. However, Vigil was different. She saw an opportunity to escape and took it. The escape. On the 3rd day of her captivity, Ray had left for work, leaving Cindy Hendy to guard Vigil. During a brief moment of carelessness, Hendy left the keys to Vigil's restraints within her reach. Seizing her chance, Vigil freed herself and attacked Hendy with a nearby ice pick, stabbing her and fleeing from the trailer, completely naked and still wearing a metal collar around her neck. Cynthia Vigil ran through the desert until she reached a nearby mobile home where a terrified couple let her in and called the police. This time, real officers arrived on the scene, and the full horror of what Vigil had endured began to unfold. The investigation. When law enforcement entered David Parker Ray's property, they were horrified by what they found inside the toy box. The trailer was meticulously organized for torture. Police discovered tapes, diaries, and equipment that suggested Ray had done this to dozens, if not hundreds, of women. In fact, Ray had recorded many of the horrific acts, taunting his victims by explaining in detail how they would never be found. Further investigation revealed that Ray had likely been operating for decades, abducting women with the help of Hendy and others. His use of a fake police officer persona was one of his primary tactics to lure victims into situations where they felt powerless and unable to resist. The aftermath. David Parker. Ray was arrested and convicted in 2001 after a trial that stunned the nation. His accomplice, Cindy Hendy, was also convicted and sentenced to 36 years in prison. Despite the horrific evidence, Ray was convicted on charges relating to only a handful of victims because many others were either dead, unable to testify, or their bodies were never found. Ray died of a heart attack in 2002, just a year after being sentenced to 224 years in prison. To this day, the full extent of his crimes remains unknown, as many believe he had more victims than were ever identified. The toy box killer case is one of the most infamous examples of how a predator can use the guise of authority to manipulate and abduct their victims. By pretending to be a police officer, David Parker Ray preyed on women's trust in law enforcement, leading them into unimaginable horror. It was a warm summer evening in a quiet suburban town where nothing much ever happened. Sarah Thompson had just finished a late shift at the local hospital and was eager to get home. The clock on her dashboard read 11:32 p.m. as she drove down the dark, nearly deserted road. Her neighborhood was only a few miles away, and she felt the familiar relief of being close to home. Her headlights illuminated the stretch of road ahead, lined with thick trees on both sides, and the only sound was the soft hum of the car engine. Suddenly, blue and red lights flashed in her rearview mirror. Sarah glanced at her speedometer. She wasn't speeding. Her heart raced as she signaled and pulled over to the side of the road, the flashing lights bathing the trees around her in an eerie glow. The police car behind her came to a stop, and she could see the silhouette of the officer through her mirrors. He stepped out, a large man in what appeared to be a police uniform, but something felt off. The officer didn't approach her car immediately, which made her uneasy. Instead, he stood by his vehicle for a moment, seemingly adjusting his belt and radio, though Sarah couldn't see any movement that suggested he was actually talking to anyone. After what felt like minutes, he finally approached her car, his flashlight pointed directly into her face, making it hard to see him clearly. "Good evening, ma'am. License and registration, please," he said, his voice deep but strangely calm. Sarah fumbled with her wallet, her hands shaking. She handed him her license and registration, but the unease inside her continued to grow. The officer didn't look at her documents right away. Instead, he just stood there, staring at her, the flashlight still blinding her. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" he asked. "No, officer, I'm sorry. I wasn't speeding, was I?" Sarah replied, her voice trembling slightly. The officer didn't answer immediately. He leaned down closer to her window, his face just out of view in the darkness. "Step out of the car," he said, his tone suddenly more commanding. Sarah's stomach knotted. "Why? What's the issue?" she asked, trying to stay calm, but something about this situation felt horribly wrong. "Just step out of the car," he repeated, more forcefully this time. Sarah hesitated, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Then, without thinking, she asked, "Can I see your badge?" There was a long pause. The officer's flashlight slowly lowered, revealing part of his face. Something was off about it, something Sarah couldn't quite put her finger on. His eyes, they were cold, emotionless. Then, instead of showing his badge, the man suddenly reached for her door handle. Panicking, Sarah hit the lock button, and the door clicked shut just as he pulled the handle. He yanked it harder, frustrated, and slammed his fist against the window. "Ma'am, this is a routine stop. Open the door," he shouted, now banging on the window with his flashlight. The force of the blows shook the car, and Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. Terrified, she quickly turned the key in the ignition and pressed the gas pedal, speeding away from the supposed officer. Her eyes darted to the rearview mirror, where she could see him running back to his car, still illuminated by his flashing lights. But something was wrong with his uniform. It looked cheap, almost like a costume. Sarah's mind raced. If he was a real cop, he would have called for backup by now, but no other police cars were showing up. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, explaining the situation to the dispatcher in a panicked voice. "Ma'am, you need to pull over immediately if you're being pursued by a police officer," the dispatcher said calmly. "I don't think he's a real cop," Sarah cried, her voice shaking. Please, just send someone. I'm near the intersection of River Road and Maple Street." The dispatcher's voice shifted slightly, growing more serious. "Stay on the line, ma'am. We're sending a unit your way. Whatever you do, don't stop." Sarah kept driving, her eyes flicking between the road and the mirror, expecting to see the flashing lights again. But the car behind her had disappeared into the darkness. Just as she was beginning to think she'd lost him, a dark shape appeared on the side of the road ahead. The same police car was parked under a broken streetlight, its engine still running. As she drove past it, Sarah could swear she saw the man standing just outside his car, staring at her, not making any effort to stop her this time. His face, now fully illuminated, was horrifying. It wasn't just emotionless, it was as though it belonged to someone wearing a mask, stiff and lifeless. Just then, the sound of sirens cut through the night, and in the distance, she saw real police lights flashing. 2 patrol cars sped toward her, passing by in the opposite direction. Sarah pulled into a well-lit gas station, her hands shaking as she waited for the real officers to arrive. Within minutes, 2 police officers pulled in behind her. They asked her questions and she described the man and the strange encounter. One of the officers nodded grimly. "You're lucky," he said. "We've been getting reports of a man impersonating a police officer in this area. You're not the first person he's tried to pull over, but we haven't been able to catch him yet." Sarah's blood ran cold. "What does he want?" "We're not sure," the officer replied, his face serious. "But whatever it is, it's not good." After filing her report, the police escorted Sarah home, but the feeling of unease lingered. For weeks, she couldn't shake the image of the fake officer's dead, mask-like face. And though the local police increased their patrols, the man was never caught. Rumors swirled around the town. Some people said he was a deranged ex-cop. Others believed he was a predator, using the uniform to lure victims. But one thing was certain. He was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for his next victim. And every time Sarah drove home late at night, she couldn't help but glance nervously at the rearview mirror, dreading the day those flashing blue and red lights would appear behind her again. Another real-life horror story involving a fake police officer is the case of Colonel Russell Williams, a high-ranking Canadian military officer who posed as a police officer to carry out some of his heinous crimes. His story shocked the entire nation when it was uncovered that this respected figure was hiding a dark and disturbing secret life. The case of Colonel Russell Williams, 2010. Colonel Russell Williams was once one of the most highly regarded military men in Canada. He was a decorated officer who served as the commander of the Canadian Forces Base CFB Trenton, one of the country's largest and most important air bases. On the outside, Williams appeared to be a respectable, disciplined leader, but underneath this facade lurked a man who would eventually be exposed as a sadistic predator. The escalating crimes. Williams's criminal behavior began with breaking into homes, but these weren't your typical burglaries. He specifically targeted women's houses, often stealing their underwear and personal belongings. Over time, his perverse actions escalated, moving from break-ins to more violent crimes. He meticulously documented his break-ins, taking hundreds of photos of himself wearing the stolen lingerie and posing in the victims' bedrooms. However, his terrifying spree wouldn't stop there. In 2009, the case took a darker turn when Williams began to escalate his criminal acts into sexual assaults and eventually murder. The fake police officer tactic. One of the most chilling aspects of Williams's crimes was the tactic he used to abduct his victims. In one case, he posed as a police officer to lure a woman into a false sense of security before committing his horrific acts. This tactic was employed when he abducted Jessica Lloyd, a young woman whose disappearance would ultimately lead to his capture. Jessica was last seen alive on January 28, 2010. On that night, Williams, dressed in civilian clothes but carrying himself with authority, pulled over near her home. He used his position of power and military stature to make her believe he was an officer conducting a routine check. This allowed him to abduct her and bring her to his home, where he subjected her to horrific abuse before ultimately killing her. Williams then disposed of her body in a remote location, thinking he could cover up the crime. The investigation and capture. Williams's downfall began when the police, investigating Jessica Lloyd's disappearance, noticed distinctive tire tracks near her home. After matching the tracks to Williams's vehicle, they called him in for questioning. At first, Williams tried to maintain his cool demeanor, confident that his status and clean reputation would protect him. However, as the interrogation went on, cracks began to appear in his story. Police soon searched Williams' home and discovered a cache of trophies from his break-ins, including underwear and photos from his victims. It was this horrifying evidence that revealed the true extent of his crimes. Williams eventually confessed to the murders of Jessica Lloyd and another woman, Corporal Marie-France Como, as well as numerous sexual assaults. The aftermath. The arrest of Colonel Russell Williams sent shockwaves throughout Canada. Not only was he a high-ranking military officer, but he had also been trusted with flying top officials, including members of the royal family. The revelation that someone so respected could commit such heinous crimes shook the public's trust in authority figures. Williams was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years. His crimes highlighted how predators can hide behind positions of power and respectability, using their status to manipulate and exploit their victims. His case remains one of the most disturbing criminal stories in Canadian history. Conclusion. The case of Colonel Russell Williams is a terrifying reminder that not all those in positions of authority are who they seem to be. By using his position and posing as a law enforcement figure, Williams was able to prey on unsuspecting victims, leaving a legacy of terror and betrayal in his wake.